Hello again, and welcome to Passion, Purpose and Grit with Sporting Memories on Goldster. My guest today is actually one of those people for whom it's easy to say she needs no introduction. Jill Douglas has shone out of our television screens for the best part of this century. Starting with Border TV in her native Scotland, she was soon sought by all the major broadcasters in television sport. Olympic, cycling, snooker, she's done them all. I wonder what happened to the playing of the film. Here it is. Yeah, she's shone out of our screens for, as I said, the best part of this century. Olympic, cycling, snooker, she's done them all, but perhaps rugby was her first love, and she's recently returned from the World Cup finals in France. Beside all that, she's helped raise millions in the researching into MND as the CEO of the My Name's Doddy Foundation. And that's when we come back to us. Good. Hi, Jill. We're going to talk about Doddy and the foundation later, but first about you. Home is where? How did it all start?
Well, very good afternoon. Lovely to see you, Higgy. And gosh, some of those photographs are a little bit alarming at times, but there we go. Yeah, all good. So I'm from Hawick in the Scottish border. So you mentioned rugby there, and of course a passion of yours, and you were able to make a career out of your love of the game, and as I was. And so I come from Hawick in the Scottish borders, and really rugby is the big sport in that part of the world. So I grew up on the farm. My family are all big sports fans, particularly rugby. And so I grew up watching the great Hawick play through the 80s, where they were totally dominant in Scotland, winning championship after championship with the likes of Jim Rennick, Colin Deans, Alan Tomes, Sally Campbell. So yeah, it was a great place to grow up. Beautiful farm. The local rugby club was at the centre of everything, and we were very good at it in Hawick. You know, we won multiple championships, and we've still been producing rugby players of that calibre, you know, all the way up to Stuart Hogg and Darcy Graham today.
And sport for yourself. I'm not so sure that women's rugby was very strong in those areas at the time. But what sports did you play, and how did you get into it?
Yeah, there was very little in the way of women's rugby. It sort of started probably when I was working for the local paper, The Southern, the early days of the women's game, and my sister-in-law, Julie, actually played to a quite high standard. But no, for me, I was mad keen on hockey. My school actually taught us to ski, so I'm still a very keen skier. In Scotland, we'd go up to Glen Shea in the Lecht and you know, up to the Cairngorms whenever we could. I like to ride my bike. I'm a keen cyclist, but a very fair weather one. And yeah, hockey would probably be my main sport at school, and horse riding. So yeah, growing up in the farm, we were all quite keen equestrian as well.
And getting into journalism, was that a no-brainer, or did you have other career choices, or how did that happen?
I was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I wanted to work in well, it was newspapers, because the Hawick News was the local paper. And when I was at primary school, Hobkirk Primary School, that's a long time ago, we went on a school trip to the local newspaper, which was a weekly paper. And I saw them laying out the pages on hot metal, and saw the journalists putting it together, and really began making my own newspapers from a very early age. And then when I went to Jedburgh Grammar School, I became editor of the school newspaper, and it was I recreated the newspaper. It was called Akimbo, and I loved it. And you had old Gestetner press used to print off the pages and distribute it around the school. And as a result of that, the local editor, John Smale from the Southern Reporter, approached me a couple of times after meeting me at careers evenings, and twice offered me a job, and I both times turned him down, because I was determined to finish my school and go off to Edinburgh University to do history and politics. And then just at the last minute, he said, and I used to do work experience with him, I was a pest, you know, I was always popping into the office and offering to do things, and just being a right pest, I think. And eventually he said, come and work for me, and don't go to Edinburgh University. We'll send you to Napier University to do newspaper journalism, but you'll be working as a journalist for us. And so by the time all of the people that are your age are coming out of uni looking for a job in a newspaper, you will have got your professional qualifications and you will have had 3 or 4 years experience. So that's what I did. I took a big leap of faith and became a junior reporter on a weekly broadsheet newspaper, real quality paper. And that's where it all began. But it was all I ever wanted to do, be a journalist, ask questions. I had a very natural curiosity, I think, my whole life. And it was news that interested me, not so much sport, but I really threw myself into the news agenda. And that led from local newspapers to doing shifts and filing for the nationals. And then a leap into Border Television as a news reporter, a sub-editor, news reporter, and finally a presenter.
So when you started, there was a junior cub reporter. You were doing all of the court reports and the police cases and all those sorts of things, were you?
Yeah, every morning I would stop at Hawick police station on the way into the office in Selkirk and go through the overnight data. You know, it would give you, you just take it all down in shorthand in your notebook and write it up in the office. And then this is well before the internet, and we didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have the internet. So everything was done on the phone in the office. I spent 90% of my day on the phone. And every couple of hours, I would do the calls around all the major police stations to find out if there'd been any incidents, cultivate relationships with people in all sorts of areas, lawyers, planners, councillors. I used to go to the local council meetings. I used to go to the local health board meetings. I used to go to the local sheriff court twice a week, Selkirk and Jedburgh. And so and you did everything from, local fetes, opening of library rooms, tree plantings, to quite weighty planning meetings. And then eventually, once you'd had some training and you'd go through it, I began to cover the courts more regularly. So eventually was covering significant murder trials, serious crime, politics, elections. And in Scotland, obviously the growth of the SNP, and we started having these debates around whether or not there should be an independent Scotland. And so it was a really interesting time. And I was a complete news hound. I loved it, and nothing excited me more than when the call came in that there'd been a breaking news story, and I'd be first out the door, and I had a little Southern Reporter van, and off I'd trot to try and find the story, with often a photographer in tow. And honestly, that's where you learn the craft. That's where you learn how to write, you learn the trade, and it was all I ever wanted to do, and I absolutely reveled in it, and put my hand up to go and do the rugby on a weekend. So I would either be at Kelso races or a point-to-point, or started doing match reports, which seems a lifetime ago now. And it was completely unique to have this young girl in the press seats amongst all these old hacks watching rugby and writing match reports. It was a complete novelty for many people.
And your first big story, a lot of the journalists I talk to say, the time when you see your name up in the byline, or you've cracked a big story, that's a big milestone in your career. Do you remember yours?
It's funny, the first byline is always a big deal. And I was very lucky. I made some great contacts. And so I used to get some great stories. And we had a big planning story up in Scotland. It was about the time when local authorities were able to sell off their housing stock to housing associations. And there was quite a lot of people involved, and there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of debate about whether or not it was the right thing, and who was going to be making money out of this, and was it all being done on the level. And so that was a long running story for me. And I think that's probably what got me in front of the local television company, because I was filing a lot of stories, and then the head of news turned up at a press conference, and I was really gobby and asking lots of hard questions, and so I think that's probably what led to me getting a chance in television. But also some of the big crime stories I covered at that point, the arrest of Robert Black, who was a serial killer, and I ended up covering his trial while I was at Border Television. And that was a big story for us at the time at the Southern. So yeah, I think those are the big stories you remember, but actually the ones that probably grabbed the headlines were probably more rural, local stories, and maybe, it was just kind of what we did week in, week out. I tell you what I used to do. I used to look at the job sheet we went to press on a Thursday. So the paper came out on a Thursday, and on a Thursday afternoon or a Friday morning, we'd get our job sheet for the week, planning ahead. And there was another reporter, Mark Entwistle, myself, there was John Smale was the editor, and then John Ross Scott JR was a great friend of our families, and he was the chief reporter. He would do the job sheet, and it would have all the stories. There was another guy called Cooler, there was another girl on the paper. It would have all the jobs on it, and I would look to see what everybody else was covering and what the stories were, and I would sidle up to them and say, I'm really interested in that. I know somebody there. Can we swap? Can we swap? And I was really manipulative. It's really bad when I think about it. And I would swap in for the stories that I thought would give me a bigger splash and where I thought I could get more traction. And so, yeah, I was already harboring ambitions, I think, at that point. I was always
and were you headhunted to television, or was it a job you saw advertised? Did you see it as a natural progression? How did you see that change from print journalism to screen journalism?
Well, I had no real interest in television news, other than I used to file stories into the Border television desk. If I came out of court, I would file them some copy or whatever. But I literally had been at a press conference in the morning, and then in the afternoon I went to court. And when I came out of the court building, which was on the main road through Selkirk, I came out after the day's court proceedings, and this big car pulled up, and this guy went down the window and he said, "I'm Neil Robinson. I'm head of news at Border Television." And I said, "Oh, hello." Yeah. And he said, "I saw you at a press conference this morning. What have you been up to?" And I said, "I've just been in court." And he said, "Give me a ring, come and talk to me. Have you ever thought about working in television?" And I said, no, I'm proper news. I like to work in print. And, I was going to move to the Times, and that's was my ambition. So I went to see him, and he said, I subbed some copy for him, and, I watched what everybody was doing for a day. And then he said, "Why don't you come and do a week with us just to see how you get on?" And we'll not, I was probably about 20 at the time. And he said, "Well, come as a sort of work experience." And I said, "I can't afford to come and work for you for a week. I mean, I can't just not work for a week. I've got responsibilities. I've got a car." I said, "If you want me to come and spend a week with you, I'll come, but you're going to have to pay me." And I think he quite liked my cheek. And so I went for a week, and then I started working with them on a sort of freelance basis. And then I got a job as a sub, and then started working, and eventually got a job. They asked me if I'd thought about presenting. And that's kind of where it started. So yeah, it was a rather creepy curb crawling incident in Selkirk, although Neil Robinson was a great boss and gave me my first chance.
You mentioned real news as opposed to television news. There's always this slight frisson, what do we call it, rivalry between the two branches of news, isn't there? How did you find that?
It was funny because, like, as I say, the print world was, where I came from, and I used to do shifts up at the Daily Record in the Edinburgh office, and that was proper old school. They had one computer terminal in the corner where you filed your copy, and it was like green letters, and a little moving cursor. But I loved it. It was they were proper old school journalists. They would go out, they would sit and smoke all day. They were on the blower all day getting stories, and I would go out sometimes with one of the old photographers, and they would say, "Oh, Jill, there's been a big trial today. Can you go and get a collect photo?" Which meant I had to go and knock on some poor person's door and ask for a picture of their dad who'd just gone down for armed robbery or something. But it felt like it was really exciting, and to work in television news, I think we were a bit skeptical about the whole television news thing. Anyway, once I began to work in television news, I could see the benefit of it. It was very immediate. And it was interesting. I liked the whole process of filing pictures and writing stories, and the process of making television. It all came very, I suppose, naturally to me. And so once I became a sort of a television news reporter, then of course you come up against the print guys, and they kind of they used to call us electronics, you know, because we
That's
worked in the and it was pre-digital. It wasn't even the digital age, but we were electronics, and they were the more weighty print news. But saying that, you know, a lot of my best pals are still in the print game, and now they're having to file on the hour, and because of the internet and because of the way that the moving news program moves so quickly, they are realizing that they're a bit like us. You know, everything has to be very immediate, and you do get at the weekends the chance to read some of the more considered features, but a lot of the time it's just literally filing the news like we did as electronics, as they called us back in the day.
Did you start as a reporter, or were you signed as a presenter, or did the two overlap?
So I started off as a sub. So basically I was writing the news. So I would be taking news copy in, I would be on PA wires, and then I would write it for television and then source the pictures to illustrate the story out of our library, or I would commission the cameraman to go and get pictures. And so I understood the nuts and bolts of how television made the screen. And then GMTV came online in 1993. And in the midst of all this, I'm sure people are so uninterested in this, but in the midst of all this, I took a year off and went to Africa because I wanted to go traveling. And it was just when I was beginning to get quite a lot of television work. And I very quickly realized that once I got onto that pathway, I wouldn't be able to step off easily. So just early on, when I began to get this interest in television, I took a year off and went to Africa traveling with a friend, and had the most incredible experience in Cape Town, and then traveled up through Africa. And it was, you know, one of the best things I ever did. And then when I came back, I had that sort of a confidence that I was just going to stroll back into television. And it's exactly what I did. I just rang up and said, I'm back. And they said, oh yeah, we've got some shifts. And within about, I don't know, 3 months, they said, look, GMTV's coming on board. We need a couple of people to run the breakfast desk. And have you ever thought about presenting? And we'll give you a screen test. So I did a screen test, and I remember we wouldn't be able to do this today, Higgy, but the head of news said to me after my screen test, he said, no, you've come over very well. You know, you've got a good voice and everything looks great on the screen. What colour is your hair? And to my shame, I said, well, what colour do you think it should be? And so, yeah, you know, I don't think they would get away with that today. But anyway, that was, and so I became part of that sort of, we did regional opt-outs in GMTV. And I was then employed on contract to be a presenter / sub. So 1 week I would sub the news and give it to the presenter, and then the next week we'd swap. And I did that with a whole variety of different colleagues. Gilly Fraser was one. And Border Television was a fantastic place to work, because we had people who'd been there when Lockerbie happened in 1988. Some of the cameramen had been first on the scene, and we had some incredibly experienced broadcasters, Fiona Armstrong, and people who'd gone off and worked at national level and then come back because it's such a beautiful place to live. But in addition to that, we covered southwest Scotland, which was like Dumfries and Galloway across to Stranraer. We covered the Scottish borders, which was all the way across to Eyemouth. And then we covered Cumbria, which included the Lake District, and parts of Northumberland, plus the Isle of Man. So we had 3 different legal jurisdictions: Scots law, English law, Manx law. We had 3 different local governments and political areas. And we had this breadth of beautiful countryside from coast to coast, which was phenomenal. You know, the stories were really interesting. So yeah, it was a great place to cut your teeth as a young reporter. And I was out on the road every day. And then I moved into presenting Look Around, which was the main evening news program. And so you'd go out in the morning with a crew, film 2 features, maybe 3, do a couple of interviews, do more interviews, send back cutting notes, record your voiceover, then hoof it back in the van, go into makeup, and then go in and present the news that evening. And I was just talking to one of my old colleagues from Border TV this week. I've been watching a program called, oh gosh, it's been on BBC Two, Newsreader, which is in Australia. Yes. And I was having panics about it because it brought it so vividly back to me, that rushing from makeup and then was screaming at me saying, 3 minutes to on air, 3 minutes to on air, with no rehearsal time, hadn't seen any of the stories, didn't even see the script till it was in front of you, and a race again, sitting in the chair, and they'd be going 3, 2, 1, you're on air, and it was honestly seat of the pants stuff. It makes me anxious even thinking about it. I still have nightmares about running down the corridor to get in the seat to present the evening news.
So moving to Rugby Special Scotland, or whatever it was actually, was it called Rugby Special Scotland, or was it called something different when you presented the rugby highlights? Was that the next step on your career?
Yeah, it was. So I used to present a programme called The Union and the League, because Cumbria covered obviously rugby union and rugby league. So because we had, Whitehaven, and we had Carlisle rugby league team, and it was quite a big sport in the north. And so I used to present this programme called The Union and the League with Graham Moss. And that brought me to the attention of BBC Scotland, and a guy called Gregor Sterling, who was the rugby producer, and he contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in having a screen test. And I laughed. I said, "You're joking. What? You're not going to have a woman presenting Rugby Special?" It was an absolute joke. But I went up to Glasgow and did a screen test for, it was called Sports Scene Rugby Special.
Right.
And they gave me the job. So I became this first woman presenting Rugby Special, presenting any kind of rugby really, in the UK. So I did Rugby Special on a Sunday, and then on a Saturday I presented the rugby news at the end of the football bulletin on Sports Scene. And then I started doing live matches. So I was doing live reporting. So quite often I'd be interviewing people pre and post match. And then I did my first sort of big Scotland match in the November of 97. November 97, I did my first sort of autumn internationals with Network BBC. I was still working for BBC Scotland, and so that's when I really sort of started getting involved in the big matches, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and you say, when did the ambition kick in, or did it never kick in? Did you just move on to the next thing because somebody offered you a job, or did you think, I've cracked it in Scotland, I've got to go national? How did it work?
I'm going to crack the States. No, I never. There was no plan. When I moved from TV news at Border Television to go and work for BBC Scotland, it was because somebody offered me the job. It was, and I remember having a big conversation with my news editor at Border Television, saying, if I take this leap into sport, that's me out of news. And she said, you just got to decide, where the opportunities are. And there were very few women working in sport at the time, and it did seem like a huge opportunity. So that was a sort of conscious decision to move into sport once the opportunity came along. Once I was working at BBC Scotland, which I loved and was doing well there, and enjoyed where I was, enjoyed where I lived. But Sky Television got in touch. Actually, one of my colleagues at BBC Scotland said, "Oh, I was talking to somebody at Sky, one of the sports news editors, and he mentioned you, but I said, no, you wouldn't move because you were really happy in Scotland." And I said, well, I think I'd like to decide that. It's for me to make that call. So I went down to see Sky, and the chance to work in lots of live sport, because live sport to me is the best environment. It's very immediate, it's instant, it's destination viewing. And these days where everybody streams and watches their catch-up TV, or does box sets, or binges on a program that they enjoy, or flicks through all the adverts. Or live sport, the only way you get to enjoy live sport with the community that is the live sport audience is by switching on to watch it live. And so to me, I love that element of it. And so Sky at that time had most of the live sport. And so I worked with them for a number of years on sports news, and did amazing work in athletics, and got the chance to do lots of Southern Hemisphere rugby, and enjoyed it very much. And then Network BBC came and asked me if I would go back and do Six Nations coverage, and to go and work back in sport. And that opened up things like the Olympics and Wimbledon and all these things. So again, it was not a plan. The only plan, I suppose, was once I worked at Sky, I wasn't getting as many chances as I wanted, and I was ambitious to work in some of the bigger events. And so I moved. That's what led to the move. But after somebody approached me and said, "Do you fancy coming and doing this?"
And how difficult was it to, I'm not saying you turned your back on Scotland, but to be out of Scotland, which was your your home, your comfort zone, if you like, and to move into the big international wide world of Sky and national broadcasting. How difficult was it for you to do that? Or was it something you decided, this is what I need to do, what I have to do, what I'm going to do?
Again, I wish I'd had a master plan, but it just kind of happened. And it was a wrench because I was living in Scotland, and Carl, who's my husband now, Carl Hogg, who was at the time, he played for Melrose, but then was played, when the game turned professional, he played for the Scottish Borders, the Border Reivers as they were, and then Edinburgh. And so he was still in Scotland. We weren't married, but I moved down to London to work for Sky, and moved to Twickenham, and it was difficult because I didn't really know that many people in London. I knew some friends through rugby at London Scottish, and so that was really fortunate. Ian Morrison and his lovely wife Ali, who Maury, of course, ended up in journalism with Scotland on Sunday, and Simon Holmes, who played in the back row with my husband as well. Holmesy was in London, so they used to sort of take pity on me on a Sunday. I'd go round and spend sort of Sunday lunch with them. But the great thing was, Sky was such a buzzy place to be. And so I kind of made lots of friends in the rugby department with Barnesy, Stuart Barnes and Dewi Morris and Mark Durden-Smith and Simon Lazenby and Martin Turner and Jules Maddox, all of whom I'm still in touch with regularly. And then the Sky Sports News team, Kelly Cates, as she is now, Kelly Dalgleish, one of my best friends. She's godmother to our daughter. She's a great friend still. I see her regularly. Kirsty Gallagher, Rodri Williams, just the guys that we worked with. We became a really tight group of friends, and Claire Tomlinson, because I was new to the area, they kind of took me under their wing, and so we had a great social life. We looked after one another, we supported one another, we had a lot of fun together. And the actual work was interesting. It was a lot of it was football, which was not my natural environment, but I soon became very well versed in the lower leagues, and so yeah, it was an exciting time. I really enjoyed it, but I was regularly up and down to Scotland, and my husband was boyfriend at the time was down, and then we got engaged at the end of that first year. I think Carl realised that I was building this life in London, so he thought he maybe better propose. So he popped the question.
So how did you find getting your head around other sports? You talked about Sky Sports News being somewhere where you could be thrown any sport. Rugby was obviously you'd grown up with rugby. You talked about your hockey earlier. So I feel that people have an instinctive grasp of the sports they've played. How did you get your head around things like cycling and athletics?
Well, it's interesting because, like, when I worked at Border Television, I used to cover all sorts of stories, and one of the big stories, ongoing stories, always in Cumbria, was Sellafield and the Thorpe reprocessing plant. And I used to go down to Whitehaven and Workington regularly to report on different developments there, whether it be new investment, people being laid off, delays in the Thorpe reprocessing plant coming online. Now, I am not, you're going to find this difficult to believe, Higgy, but I am not a nuclear physicist. And so how nuclear power actually works is something quite difficult for me to grasp. That said, I am quite good at asking a question. And if I can understand the right questions to ask, to represent the person at home that wants to ask those questions. And you don't have to understand the science to understand the news story. A good story is a good story. And so when it comes to sport, I have never played rugby. I've played touch rugby, but I have never played rugby. I've never run in an Olympic 100-meter final. I've never competed at a World Championships track cycling. However, many journalists are in the same boat. Many broadcasters are in the same boat. We know what a story is, and we know how to do our research, and we know how to ask a question. We know how to be briefed, and we know what the person at home needs to get out of what we're broadcasting. And so when it came to things like the football, of course, if you've got an inquiring mind and have got a sporting mind, you understand what sport is about. You understand the nuances behind it. And interestingly, when I worked at Border Television, sometimes people would, when we were running through in the morning what we were all going to be covering, and somebody would say, oh, somebody needs to go to Brunton Park and interview Michael Knighton, or somebody has to go and interview Mervyn Day, the manager. I'd say, oh, I can do that. Or they would say, oh, Vanessa, can you go and do that? She goes, oh, I don't do sport. I don't understand. I don't. And I think, well, you can go and ask the football manager a couple of questions about the game. You don't need to, yes, I do get the offside rule, but I don't need to understand everything to do that. And so I was very open to sport and sports reporting. So once I was at Sky, I worked with these brilliant people who really knew their sport, and producers who would brief me and help me and support me. And then when it came to the actual live sport, you just say what you see, you watch it, you understand it. And the other thing, I remember covering gymnastics once at BBC and thinking, this is not something I really grasp. But very quickly, if you arrive at a venue, you can lock eyes on somebody who you think, that is the person who is going to give me and I'd go and say, have you got half an hour? Can you just help me? I'm really interested in what you're doing, but I really need somebody to just talk me through one or two bits. And then you'd be off and running, because then you would suddenly get a passion for it. And the cycling I kind of was aware of. I always enjoyed things like the Tour de France, but the track cycling, I knew who Chris Hoy was.
Yeah.
He had success in Kuala Lumpur, and then he'd gone to Sydney to the Olympics. So, and I knew who Jason Quealy was. I knew who Chris Boardman was. So when I was given the chance to work in cycling, a lot of others in the sports department were like, oh, I'm not so sure. I threw myself in it. I thought, absolutely, I love this. And at the time, we weren't very good at it in Great Britain. We were just becoming good. And so I got involved at the ground level, and then I've been able to be part of this incredible success story just by, being in at the beginning. So, you do the research, but you have to just be open to it, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned always mentioned all the way through, preparation is the key, isn't it? You have to do your homework. You can't just turn up and busk it, or you'll get found out if you do.
You can, but at the same time, you can do too much. And I think, if you go into an interview situation and you start trying to show how much you know, but show how much homework you've done. So you say, well, talking to, I don't know, Chris Hoy, oh, you've knocked 5 seconds off your best time. You've never beaten that guy before. You've come out on the track. You've put in the best, you dropped your chain in the first round, but then you've come back. How do you feel? And he's like, well, you've said it all, really, you want them to tell you all that. So the more, and a very good editor, Martin Turner, who I worked with at Sky, who was a rugby producer, said to me, we used to call him Tina, we're so clever. He said to me, the more you try and show how much you know, the more people begin to wonder how much you know.
Yeah.
If sometimes the simplest question is the simplest question. And actually, if people are remembering the questions I ask, I'm not doing the right job. They should be remembering the answers that I elicit. So it's about what the person you're talking to is saying, not what I'm saying. And that's just you sometimes need a bit of confidence to realize, don't try and be too smart with your question. Just try and get a really good answer. Yeah. And so, yes, but in order to get to that position, you need to feel confident that you know what you're talking about, and once they've answered, whether you need to go back in and ask something else. And listening is a skill, as my husband tells me many times.
And there's also a thing that if you make it look too easy, if you ask just simple questions, somebody's going to phone up and say, what do you do the rest of your day? I've had that a few times.
I don't care, though. I genuinely don't care, because broadcasting is, my job is to act as a conduit between the live action and the live protagonists and the viewer who's watching or listening at home. That's it. It's not about sounding clever. It's not about showing how much homework you've done. And so sometimes sometimes it can look very easy, but what the viewer doesn't see is all the other stuff that's going on around it. So when you're trying to grab Brian O'Driscoll when he's played his last game for Ireland and they've won a Grand Slam and he's in Paris and every single person there wants a piece of him, and you've got 4 other broadcasters and you're all live and you're all under massive time pressure, and you've got a lot of very excited people. You've got photographers, you've got floor managers, you've got media managers, and you've got colleagues and teammates all in on the act. And how you get hold of that one person and put them in front of your camera and you ask them the right question at the right time with all of that noise going on and all of the noise in your ear, that's where the experience comes in. And when you're live at a Rugby World Cup at a quarter final, and for some reason you don't go live to air because somebody's pressed the wrong button or somebody hasn't pressed a button at all, and everything is kicking off in your ear, your guests are beginning to look anxious and stressed and wondering what's going on, your floor manager is trying to find out, you've got 2 or 3 people in your ear all shouting and trying to find out, and you realize that in 20 seconds the camera's going to cut live to you regardless of what everybody else is saying, and you have to know what to say, and you have to sound as though you know what you're doing, and you take away all the anxiety and take away all the stress so that your guests are comfortable. And it might look easy, and it should look easy, but sometimes it's not easy. And that's where all of those miles of border television, air miles as I like to call them, comes into play, because that's the experience that helps you get through. Because when it's all going swimmingly, it isn't that hard, but it doesn't always go swimmingly.
So how do you keep your calm? Do you consciously practice keeping your calm, or do you feel you're a naturally calm person that can cope? Or is it the confidence of experience? How does it?
It's the confidence of experience, and everything slows down.
Yeah.
Slow everything down. Because until you just keep talking until somebody tells you otherwise, until they sort out whatever it is they're trying to sort out. If the VT's gone or something's not happened or the guest's not arrived, all you can do is just slow everything down and give everybody a chance to catch up. And that's what you do. And I think it's happened multiple times. It will continue to happen multiple times. You've got to back yourself to know what to do in those instances. And it can be quite exciting. I remember that after the World Cup final in Paris, just a couple of, at the end of October, they were coming back to us and they were trying to fit earpieces to my guests, who were Brian Habana and Lawrence Delalio, and then the makeup was in trying to powder them down. It was pouring with rain, nobody cared, just let's get live. And they were on a commercial break and they were trying to get off a VT so they could come to us, and they were praying that I would get Sia Khaleesi live. Yeah. And I was thinking, how am I going to get Sia Khaleesi live? Like literally everybody in this stadium is trying to get him live. He's trying to celebrate with his family. It could be on the other side of the pitch, for all I knew. How am I going to get him live? And they were yelling, have you got Khaleesi? Where's Khaleesi? We're coming to you now, Jill. I could see Mark Pugac throwing to me. I could see all the tech crew fitting earpiece and everything. And I just went, everybody off, let's. And then just as they threw to me, I looked at Brian Habana, and from behind came Sia Khaleesi. I'm just like, and I got a hold of him, and I had a grip of him, and I started talking to him, and I was gripping him really tightly, like, you are not going anywhere till I've done this interview. And about halfway through his first answer, I suddenly thought, maybe I should let go now, because this is a little bit uncomfortable. And he's probably thinking, yeah, you can let go now. So I sort of disentangled myself like this. And anyway, and it all worked. And of course it does 9 times out of 10 work, but it just comes with a little bit of experience and just slowing it all down and not panicking. Because panic is infectious in a television broadcast. And if I panic, everybody panics.
Yeah. So you've talked about that World Cup. You've done other Rugby World Cups, Olympics, cycling. What's been your favourite broadcasting experience of all the big events you've done?
Well, Higgy, I must say, and I don't know if you would agree with me here. I'd like to think you would, but I think 2003 Rugby World Cup in Australia was extraordinary for all sorts of reasons. But you and I were part of Five Lives team in Australia, and we had the most incredible trip around Australia. We just went from coast to coast. We saw great rugby. We spent a lot of fun times together as a team. We were part of that incredible story with England going all the way to the final. So I would say, it's got to be right up there as being one of the standout experiences. 2 months in Australia following a successful England team all the way to a World Cup final is, there's something badly wrong with you if that's not a career highlight. But prior to that, I did Athens as my first, actually no, straight after that, 2004. Athens was my first Olympics. And I just, what a privilege to be involved, and all Olympics since then have been special. So whether it's been, Rio, Tokyo was a different experience because we were in lockdown. I did it in a really controlled way, and Beijing. But probably another big highlight for me, if I had to pick highlights, I'd say Rugby World Cup 2003, Rugby World Cup in Japan was in 2019 was off the scale. What an amazing place to be. But I think the London Olympics 2012 still for me is one of the most amazing experiences, not just as a broadcaster, not just professionally, but just as a sports fan, to be there, to get that incredible sense of togetherness, that unity, that joy that the Olympics brought to the country, and to be there in the velodrome, to see Sir Chris Hoy winning those gold medals, and to see Brad winning on, the time trial. I'd been in Paris 10 days before to see him win the Tour de France. So yeah, that I think the London Olympics is the best Olympic Games I've been involved in for all of those reasons. And I would say the Rugby World Cups have been, just superb, all of them. But I think the standouts for me would have to be 2003 and 2019.
We talked about the 2003 World Cup final. They just had the 20th anniversary, and it was good to see all of the team looking slightly not worse for wear, but they've matured well, I suppose, as have we all, of course. But another sad anniversary around this time has been the death of Doddy Weir, and you are the CEO of the Doddy My Name's Doddy Foundation. How did your involvement in that come about?
So yes, we sadly lost Doddy a year ago this weekend just gone, and we've been reflecting on it. We think about Doddy every day. The anniversary is just another day that you're thinking about Doddy. But yeah, it's been tough, really, for everybody that was close to Doddy, because he leaves a huge void, in our lives, particularly for Kathy and the boys. So I grew up with Doddy. I've known him. I knew him when we were in our teens, growing up in the Scottish borders, ponies, horses, young farmers, rugby, all of those things. And he was our best man, godfather to our son, just a great friend, just somebody that was in our lives. And when he was diagnosed at the end of 2016, it was very, very hard and very difficult for him to process, and for his family. And when we found out, when he told us, it was heartbreaking, really, because having seen how the disease affects people, we'd seen what happened to Joos van der Westhuizen and others, Jared Cunningham. It was horrific, really. You just cannot believe that this vibrant, full of life, vital individual is going to, succumb to this terrible, terrible disease. And when he shared the news more widely in June, we'd had a bit more time to process that. But to see the outpouring of love and support for Doddy at that time was incredible. And he and the family were able to go off to New Zealand with the Lions and have a great, building memories, a fantastic time there. But when he came back, we launched a trust for Doddy because so many people wanted to help him personally, but he was uncomfortable with that. So in the first instance, we raised a bit of money for Doddy himself and his family through the trust in order to help him with the different things that he was going to require as a result of the disease. But then very quickly he said, no, he wanted to shut that down. And so we, in November 2017, we launched My Name's Doddy Foundation. And it came about as a group of us, John Jeffrey, Finlay Calder, myself, Scott Hastings, some good friends of Gary Armstrong, good friends of Doddie's, sitting in a room saying, he was saying, there's no hope, there's not enough being done, there's not enough awareness. I'm lucky, I've got a great support network, not everybody has this, we need to do something, and I want to help push the research forward. And so we set up the foundation, and so here we are 6 years later, having invested £11 million into vital MND research. We've hopefully shifted the dial a little bit. I think people are much more aware of the disease now. We do feel as though there is momentum within the research community. We feel there's a bit more optimism, and there are things coming online. There's certainly clinical trials that we didn't have 5 years ago. So progress is being made, but it's slow, and it's not going to be one thing. There's not going to be a silver bullet for this disease. It's going to be a combination of treatments, probably, to find effective treatments. But it's been a real learning curve for me, and from a very sort of cottage little industry, sitting around a kitchen table and putting together some ideas, we've grown into a very entrepreneurial, significant stakeholder within the MND community, and we've built fantastic relationships throughout that community with people affected by the disease, the researchers, other charities, and we just make a nuisance of ourselves, if I'm being honest. We're a bit disruptive, and we challenge people, and we collaborate with people, we work with people, we ask difficult questions, and we come at things maybe slightly differently from others. But we're now a very sustainable charity with a big responsibility to make sure that all of the incredible money we raise gets spent in the right way. You know, that due diligence must be done, and it's a huge responsibility when you are, you know, raising this type of money, to make sure it's spent in the right way. And so we take that very, very seriously. But it's been a really exciting, it's been an interesting journey along the way.
I was going to say, did you realize yourself what you were letting yourself in for when you started it all off, and then now you're the CEO of a foundation that raises £11 million? You know, how did you anticipate that yourself?
Never, no. And I'm a doer, you know. So when we were talking about let's do this, let's do that, I ended up being the person doing it. And so I think John Jeffrey at one point said, I think you should just be running it. You should be the CEO. And I said, well, we definitely need somebody to run it. And he said, well, can you do it? I said, well, I'll do it to get us going, and then we'll see where we are. And of course,
you're still there.
You're still there. But what happened was I had incredible support from all of these amazing people, and Kenny Logan has been involved from the beginning, you know, with his company, just helping us with some of our commercial interests. Rob Wainwright, another great friend, with some of our big Doddy Aid initiatives. So some really very good people right from the beginning have been involved. And then slowly I've brought in people to help run the business. So we've got a great CFO and a director of fundraising. And we always want to stay small and nimble, and we want to just have a real core team of, I always say we're a small but high functioning team, and that's what we want to be, a small team. And probably the most important addition to the team was Jess, our research director, because we've got a guy called Sean McGrath, who's incredible. He's our medical strategy lead. He came in at the beginning to help us build those relationships within the MND research community. But Jess has come in and has created our research strategy, and that really helps us determine which areas of research we want to invest in and attract people bidding for grants. And so that's been and we're now, you know, got real strong processes to make sure we're doing everything in the right way and getting the best bang for our buck. And so if people come to us and say, how are you going to spend the money? If we have money for you, we can demonstrate really clearly how that money is spent. So it's been a big learning curve for me. The commercial side of it and the brand side of it came quite naturally, because that's an area that I work in anyway when I'm not broadcasting, through some work in the insurance industry. So the brand piece but the key thing has been the storytelling, how we explain to people what we're doing and what we're trying to do. And again, that comes through the journalism. I have just done a managerial finance course at LSE because I realized that I needed to upskill myself as well. So that's been an interesting piece. So you never stop learning, Higgy, as you know. So it's been an interesting time, but I'm just lucky that I have got brilliant people around me, because they are the ones that really go the hard yards, and I just I think running a business like this, as I call the charity a business, because it really is, it's just making decisions, you know, and trying to get as many of them right as you can, and making sure that the team are well looked after.
Yeah. And just for those who are listening and watching, don't know precisely what MND is, motor neurone disease, can you just give us a quick thumbnail sketch of what it is, how it affects?
Yeah, so MND, or ALS, if you know, is called more globally, particularly in the US, is a neurodegenerative disease. It affects, in the UK, there's probably about 5,000 people living with the disease at any one time in the UK, which might make you think, oh, it's a rare disease. It's not a rare disease. You have a lifetime chance of 1 in 300 of developing the disease. So the reason that there's only 5,000 people living with it at any one time is you have got a very short prognosis. So most people would die between 2 to 3 years and lose their ability to walk within a year. And it affects your neurons, and so it basically stops your muscles from working. The messages are not reaching your muscles and telling them to do what they need to do. So it affects people in different ways. So often it affects people in their bulbar regions. So their speech is first affected and they're swallowing. They find themselves choking. Or it affects their extremities. So in Doddy's case, it was his hands. Quite often it's people's hands, or they might have drop foot. So they would have a problem with their foot or their lower limbs. And eventually it attacks all the muscles. And so you eventually have difficulty. Doddy couldn't move his arms, so you had what you would call flailing arms. So the difficulty for him was, if he was unsteady on his feet, he couldn't brace himself with his arms. He would just go down, and when you're 6'7", you're going to fall a long way. So that often affects people. Most people end up having to use some form of mobility equipment. A lot of people end up with a peg because they can't eat anymore. They need assistance with their breathing because their lungs stop working, and they lose the ability to speak. And so they need to be fully supported with eating, breathing, cleaning. They can't go to the toilet on their own. Basically everything that they took for granted, everything that we all take for granted, slowly deteriorates to the point that they can't breathe anymore. And then sadly they die. I mean, it is the most brutal of diseases. And it affects men and women. It tends to affect people. The majority of people are older when the symptoms become through, but actually more and more we're seeing people in younger years. You know, we see people in their 30s, 40s, 50s affected by the disease. It is indiscriminate, and it is, when you see somebody that you love and care for going through it, it's very difficult.
The highest profile cases we've seen, perhaps, or maybe because of my interest, have been rugby players. Is there any connection when we're talking about Craig Barrow and Jared Cunningham and Doddy and now Ed Slater at Goldster? Is there a connection between rugby, a link between rugby and MND?
There has been no proven link. There's no science to say there's a link. It's a bit like, because it's the world that we inhabit and these guys are high profile, you wonder, is there a link? But actually, how many firemen develop MND? How many policemen? How many plumbers? We don't, you know.
Yeah,
that's
where we are.
But there's some interesting research being done, and we're supporting that research up in Sheffield with Professor Dame Pam Shaw, who's one of the leading researchers in this country, clinicians, amazing woman, Pam. And she is looking at whether strenuous activity, strenuous exercise can have an effect if you have a predisposition to developing the disease, i.e. if you've got a specific genetic makeup, if you then have that genetic makeup and you add into that strenuous exercise, could that have an effect? And that's a piece of research that's underway at the moment. Doddy never believed that rugby had caused his MND. He felt there were people who had more concussions, for instance, or head injuries than him, who've never developed any neurological condition. And it mustn't be confused with dementia, because it's a very different disease. And so my view would be more work needs to be done in the area so that we better understand the disease and what causes it. We know that maybe 10% of people who develop MND have got different genetic makeup. Those genes have been identified, but the vast majority of people have got what's called sporadic MND. And so it's not hereditary, it's not familial, it's nothing to do with it's nothing to do with the genetic makeup that we know about so far. And so there's an awful lot more work needs to be done in working out where the disease comes from. And certainly, if there's research that looks at different causations, then we would want to support that. But at the moment, there is no scientific link between MND and rugby per se, or any other type of physical sport.
So where is your money going to go? Is it on the gene therapy, the idea of finding the right gene that, or the lack of the right gene that causes the MND, or is it in other directions?
Well, we have invested significant funds into gene therapy through a couple of professors, particularly Chris Shaw at King's in London. He's an eminent professor. But also we've invested money in drug repurposing. So this is because of stem cell technology now, you can recreate MND in the lab, which, with cancers, obviously you can take biopsies and you can create the cells in a lab because you can draw the cells out of a patient. Well, you can't do that with MND because you can't really, it's difficult to take cells out of the brain. So the stem cell technology has progressed so far that we can now recreate the disease, and then you can then test existing drugs to see if any of those have an effect. And that means you're looking at already licensed drugs, which makes it a lot easier. So there's a lot of drug repurposing work underway at the moment. We've invested in that. We've invested in clinical trials, which allows us to test drugs with patients. It allows patients access to clinical trials, which, if you're given a cancer diagnosis, you will immediately be offered a trial of some kind. With MND, that's only really in the last couple of years that's even been considered, because they had nothing to test. So that's coming through now. But we're also looking at emerging science and emerging treatments. And, we don't close the door on anything. We will work with anybody that we feel has got a good project or an opportunity to move the dial. And we've got a really robust research strategy. So if anybody's interested to go through the fine detail, just take a look at some of the areas that we're interested in. Do have a look at the website, My Name's Doddy Foundation website, because there's a lot of information there. And our team have made it very accessible. We try and tell our story very clearly so that you don't need to have the degree in neuroscience to understand what it is we're trying to do and the kind of areas that we're investing in.
And is there a time scale, a wished for time? We hope to have cracked MND by a certain time, or can you not even put a target on it?
Gee, Higgy, I wish we could do it today. I wish we could do it yesterday. I wish we'd done it 5 years ago. Doddy set off on this crusade, and I think part of him did wonder if something might come through for him. But even when it became clear that we weren't going to get something that would be in time for him, he still wanted us to carry on. He said, "You must pick up the baton and carry on what I started." That was his legacy. And, how long will it take? I feel as though there is genuine optimism and momentum. When you talk to the professors today, they say, for the first time, they now talk about effective treatments, if not a cure, effective treatments within their lifetime. It's not quick. It's not cheap. It's expensive, and we have been able to commit significant funds as a result of the great support that we receive. And then we try and leverage out money from elsewhere with those funds. But we're in it for the long game. And if we can move it forward, then that's all we can ask for. But it will take a huge amount of effort. And so, our next big thing will be Doddy Aid. We launched that in December. We go live beginning of January, and it's a fantastic way for the community to come together. Rugby, sports, even if you just walk the dog, doesn't matter what you do, get active in January during Doddy Aid. Sign up, you get a snood, you become part of a team, and you just log your miles, whether it's swimming, hiking, canoeing, skiing, sledging, doesn't matter what you do. You're part of it, and it costs you 20 quid and you're in. And that's really all you have to do. And it's a great thing, Doddy Aid. It's been a great fundraiser for us, but it also gets people talking about the foundation, gets people talking about MND, and that's really our aim.
Well, the circumstances of your getting involved in MND and Doddy Aid and so on are the worst possible, but the outcome seems to be, and I'm sure Doddy would have approved of this, to be something optimistic and positive. And you know, congratulations on what you've achieved so far, and good luck with everything that you're going to do in the future with My Name's Doddy. But what about yourself? Just a final finish on where's your career going from here in the broadcasting world?
I seem to lurch from one thing to the next. So I think, listen, I'm focused on some European rugby. I've got some Six Nations to look forward to. I've got the Olympics in Paris next summer. I'll be down in the San Quentin Velodrome near Versailles, which I can't wait for that. So yeah, I've never looked too far in advance. I enjoy the work, and as long as people still are happy for me to be holding the mic, I'll carry on holding the mic. And you know, I enjoy it. The day I stop enjoying it, the day will be the day I stop. But as long as I'm able, I like to ask questions. I'm curious. I'm still curious, and that's and passionate about it. And I consider it a huge privilege to do what I do. And yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
Long may you continue, Jill. It's been absolutely a joy talking to you and hearing about your life and about the Doddy Foundation. Really great fun talking to you. Hope to catch up with you again soon. But for the moment, everyone, that was Jill Douglas and talking about the Doddy Foundation. Thanks very much, Jill.